Hey folks, it's Swank Ivy, and I'm bringing you another Letters to an Asexual. This is number 40. Nice milestone. For this one, I am not going to be featuring an ignorant person's message. I will be featuring one message, but it's not an ignorant one. It's just a good illustration of the topic I'm going to talk about today. And I'm also going to paraphrase some other sentiments that people have sent to me over the years. Today I'm going to talk about terminology. Now, back in the day when I was the only person I knew of who was talking about asexuality, maybe just to my friends or on my personal website, I called myself non-sexual. And one of the major things I said defined my non-sexuality is that I didn't want to have sex. And now the mainstream narrative about asexuality is that we don't experience sexual attraction. That is also true of me. I don't feel sexual attraction to anyone, and I do adopt that as kind of the most easy go-to for a definition if I need one, although as long as I have space, I always make sure to mention that there are alternate definitions that some people prefer to use, such as that they don't find sex to be satisfying, or they don't find sex worthy of pursuing, don't like sex, don't need sex, besides not feeling sexual attraction. And of course, there's the fact that some people do identify as being on the asexual spectrum, but maybe gray sexual or maybe demisexual, and therefore they may experience sexual attraction but also feel that they fit into the asexual spectrum. So, you can't really be entirely cut and dried with the way that you talk about asexuality when you get really into the nitty gritty. So, that also applies to some other terminology that we use, such as demisexual. Some people will say, well, I'm demisexual, and that means that I only feel sexual attraction to people once in a while, or after a really long period of time getting to know them and developing other positive feelings toward them. And then some other people might say, well, I feel that way. I'm a straight person who has only ever experienced attraction to one or two people in my life, and I never felt like I needed to call myself something other than straight. And usually as soon as I hear that kind of, I never felt like I needed to blah blah blah, I always feel like there's some intended invalidation in that, because whether you feel like you need a term for this should be kind of irrelevant as to whether it has a term. You can choose whether you want to use that term, and whether it's useful in your life should be one of the major determining factors as to whether you use this term. If somebody else has felt alienated by mainstream sexual culture and has felt like maybe they needed a different label to describe what they're experiencing, that should be completely valid, and there shouldn't be this movement to try to stop them from giving that a name. Just because somebody wants to give that a name, wants to use it for themselves, does not mean that they're going to somehow force you to use it, or somehow the popularization of this term is going to force people who don't want to identify that way to identify that way. That's kind of absurd. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and read you one of the messages that I got fairly recently regarding aromanticism. Someone on Tumblr wrote to me and in part said this: I wanted to point out that aromantic people can want romantic relationships too, similar to the way asexuals can want sex. They lack romantic attraction, but that doesn't mean they don't want romance or to participate in romantically coded acts. I believe the specific name is cupio-romantic. And some people might say that person is splitting hairs, but I don't really think so. As an aromantic person who doesn't desire romantic relationships and doesn't really like to see her life in the context of romance, I still understand that the romantic attraction experience is also something that I don't feel, and that is usually the mainstream definition of feeling aromantic, is that you don't experience romantic attraction. Whether you actually want a relationship in spite of that might be a separate experience for some people. But what I want to also point out is that if someone feels that not wanting a relationship is actually the defining pinpoint of why they use the term aromantic, they should also be recognized as being an aromantic person. I feel like the definitions are only important as far as their usefulness. And if somebody feels like they're using this term and people are constantly misinterpreting them, they may look for a more specific term, or they may want to use a different term, or just stop using these terms altogether, stop talking about it. It just kind of ends up being more about what's practical in the long run. And of course, if you're finding that you're a demisexual person and nobody really knows what you're talking about when you say you're demisexual, on the one hand, of course, you can participate in more awareness or spread more of the words of demisexual activists who are doing a great job getting people to understand what the term means. But then you can also understand that in the present climate, a lot of people don't know what demisexual means, and you can choose, instead of saying demisexual, to say what you actually mean by that. Like, well, I just don't really find a lot of people attractive. I've only found a couple people attractive, and it's really not a huge priority to me right now. Maybe that's somebody's experience of demisexuality. And what I do find is that if you use a term, especially an unknown or less known term, people tend to get more aggressive about it. I definitely find that if I say I'm not really interested in relationships, or I just don't really find people attractive that way, I don't get as many questions as when I say something like I'm asexual. And then everybody wants to know, number one, what does that mean? But number two, they want to talk me out of it. Of course, I'm talking about people who maybe are grilling you about your sexuality in an inappropriate context. A lot of times these things will come up in like a work environment or somewhere where you're not really comfortable discussing your specific sexual attraction experiences, and someone is forcing you into it because they seem to think this should be fair game to talk about. And sometimes I have recommended for people who want to be safe in these conversations and they don't want to disclose certain things about their identities to people who may subject them to exhausting and triggering experiences, that they may shy away from using terminology. It's not always the best in the long run for people to escape talking about it. But I want individuals in these compromising situations to be safe and to feel safe, being truthful in their conversations without endangering themselves. So I do recommend sometimes that people will use vaguer language to talk about their orientations if they don't feel like they're in a situation where the person is actually going to listen. It's sometimes really hard to figure out when that's going to be. You can't always predict it, especially in those situations where you would have sworn that the person was going to be a good ally and they turn out not to be. But anyway, back to the terminology discussion. Definitions often have multiple meanings, and insisting upon them having one really narrow definition tends to make conversations less easy to have, especially when you start arguing over who has the right to use these words. Now, I hope that I don't alienate too many people saying this, but I feel more comfortable with permissive uses of terminology. I feel that if someone thinks a term fits them, they should use it, and that they shouldn't necessarily be grilled or given the third degree as to why they think they have a right to that term, especially with something like asexual people who nevertheless have sex, or maybe someone who feels like they want to be considered to be part of the LGBTQ plus community, and that they feel that their experiences qualify them for that. But then some people are saying they don't belong there because they might be in a relationship that is interpreted as a straight relationship, and therefore they're not experiencing the kind of attacks that can come if you're dealing with homophobic people. I think that it's really important that we all understand intersectionality, and we also understand the way it looks from outside. I think I've said this before, where people will say if you're aromantic like me, or heteroromantic like a lot of people in my community, that you have no business allying with the LGBTQ community as part of it, or that you're not entitled to use these words. I think that they just don't understand that, like, the straight people kind of don't want us either. That we get a lot of pushback, that it feels different. It's not necessarily homophobic, because, a lot of times they're not assuming that we have a same-sex relationship, or treating us like that. But it is kind of similar. It's like there is this assumption that you're straight, and that you're cisgender, and that you're gender conforming. And if you are not these things, you tend to get a little bit more pushback. I think that that's invisible to a lot of people who don't experience it. And there's not really all that much of a practical purpose in quantifying that and deciding, like, we're going to put this measurable level on it, and if you've experienced up to or more than this particular threshold, then you're allowed in. There's not like an in, there's not a specific gate that you have to be able to pass with a membership card that says I've been hurt X number of times. And furthermore, I've talked about this before, but I don't think that it has any practical purpose either to define, like, membership on basis of identity, according to how much you've been hurt or who hates you and how they express that hatred. I think that we really need to cultivate a culture where inclusion is more of the norm. And I think a really important aspect of that is respecting people's terminology. So going back to kind of asexuality and joining that into it, I've seen people call themselves lesbian asexual who are not sexually attracted to women, and I've seen the same people say those women do not belong in the club because lesbian is only for people who are sexually attracted to women or sleep with women or date women. And it's like they expect it to look like a particular kind of performance. And just ultimately, I cannot support people who say that categorically any group of people who wants to use a certain term for an authentic reason to describe themselves needs to get out. So back to kind of the comment that I got on my Tumblr, where the person was saying that aromantic people sometimes do date. It's very true that sometimes we do things that some people think are not consistent with who we are. And the fact of the matter is, you, as the person experiencing it, get to say what is consistent with your identity. You can't say aromantic people never date, because maybe sometimes they do. Maybe sometimes they have relationships that aren't just queer platonic or just platonic, period. They might have romantically coded relationships. They might have romantic dates. They might have sexual intercourse with their dates. But even if they're not feeling romantic attraction in the context of that, they may still have like a personal need or like a societally influenced desire to see what this is like, or to try this out, or may want those experiences independently of feeling any attraction. So sometimes it gets very, very specific. Sometimes it gets very difficult to separate, well, what is part of this identity? What is part of the identity that I'm using this label for? And I just think the best answer is always, do you have a reason for using that term? And, do you have some kind of claim on it that is held in actual authentic understanding of yourself? Is it, it shouldn't be something like, a person is claiming that, like, we've heard all this noise in the news lately of, say, men who are upset about transgender women using the women's room, they're claiming that these people are actually men and that they don't deserve to have access to women's spaces if they're trans women because they're actually men, which is ridiculous. And that these men are saying, well, what if I just said, I'm a woman, so I want to go in there. You can't tell me that, all you SJWs and all you people that are pushing political correctness on us, you're saying that my gender presentation doesn't matter, only my identity. So what if I'm a gender fluid person who, I'm a man most of the time, but when I have to pee, I'm suddenly a woman and I have to go in the women's room. That's what you people are saying. That's not an authentically held position. That's like an aggressive position that is designed to create a gotcha. And it is really obscene, honestly. Because whenever I say stuff like this, or whenever you see these conversations happening, you always have people like that in the comments who are saying, well, what if XYZ devil's advocate? And these are not things that the person really imagines happen. They just want to create an impossible situation that will force people like us to agree that our perceptions of how gender and other situations work are ultimately absurd if you take them to their natural end. These people who are always claiming that the snowball effect, these slippery slopes all over the place, they're creating really awful situations for us to respond to so that they can invalidate us. And those are not the kind of things that I ever want to see argued in my comments, that I ever want to engage with somebody like that, because, I can't even say they're a troll, because they're responding in a way that they think is actually consistent with what we're saying. I've dealt with so many of them in my comments who are saying, like, how can you say you're an asexual person if you've ever had sex? How can you say you're an asexual person if you have sex? And those things are not a contradiction in terms, any more than, a person who wants children and is asexual is being ridiculous. But I've dealt with so many people who seem to think that those two things are incompatible with each other, and they are not. So hopefully I don't sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but I believe that the bottom line is that identity depends on whether you find the term useful. And that's why I also support changing your label if how you perceive yourself changes. And I don't think that that suggests weakness. I don't think that that suggests that you weren't an authentic example of what you used to call yourself back when you used that term. I don't think you're weakening our community. I don't think that you're making us look silly if you try on different labels to try to figure out what fits you. I don't think that you're weakening any of our narratives if you're not sure if a term is right for you, but you decide to start using it as an experiment. I just really don't think that these terms are that important. I think that terms are important because we need to be able to have the conversations, and I think that the labels that pop up help us connect with each other, help us understand that there are experiences we may not have considered out in the wild there, and maybe also help us decouple certain things that don't necessarily need to be together, such as, people who assume that if you're married and or in a romantic relationship, it means you must be having sex with each other. Those two things are not necessary for a marriage to really be a marriage, So I think that if we look at what terms people use, we should always ask, well, what does it mean to you? We should never come from the perspective that that person probably doesn't deserve to use it and try to talk them out of feeling entitled to use it. That you should always approach a person who uses a certain term with an open mind, assuming that they probably have a reason for using it. And I'm not saying that you can't question it. I'm not saying that you can't critique certain people using terms that you think maybe aren't appropriate for them, but try to come at it with, like I said, an open mind, and, you know, maybe introduce them to new terms that may fit them better if you think that maybe they're misleading others by using a term that doesn't really fit them. So I hope that that makes sense to some of you folks that may have been kind of confused about what terms mean, or may have been frustrated by how muddy the waters have gotten. Because, to be honest, heterosexuality is a lot more complicated than a lot of people claim that it is. But it's just that we've always accepted that there are so many shades to it, and, you know, that none of these things divorce them from the heterosexual camp. But then, you know, you have something relatively new like the term asexuality in the context that we're using it, and suddenly everyone's all over us to have a cohesive description of what we mean by it, and to be united as a community as to how we use the term. And that's just not really very practical. It's just not how human nature works, and it never has. And the mainstream is going to have to get over that. They have to stop expecting our community to be held to standards that they don't hold themselves to. So that's going to be the conclusion of this one, and I'll see y'all in the next one.